Now we're getting into things that are specific to a flight controller. Except for one thing, I guess. What I should do next, before we jump ahead to things like GPS and airspeed sensor and that kind of stuff, let's just talk about receiver. Now the interesting thing about a receiver when you're connecting to a flight controller is because the flight controller has the servo connections on here, you don't need a receiver that has its own set of servo ports. In fact, even if you did have one, you wouldn't connect your servos to the receiver, because if you do, then the flight controller won't be able to do its magic. And it's quite possible you can take, you know, a pretty standard receiver like this, what is it called? It's a brick anyway. It's basically a Spectrum orange brick receiver with its own servo rail here. Now you can take that and run the S-bus out from that receiver and take it into the flight controller and it'll work. But you don't need these servo ports, servo connectors on the receiver. You not only don't need them, you shouldn't use them. So why have all of that? Instead of that, I have this. Look how tiny that is. I mean, the antenna by itself is almost as big as the receiver itself. This is a Express LRS receiver. I've also had good experiences with FSX6B with iBus and S-bus out to the flight controller, but I typically use Express LRS these days. And this simple Express LRS receiver, which there's lots of videos about Express LRS, so I'm not going to explain how that all works. But the difference is, the interesting thing about the Express LRS receiver, all I need to connect is this one little wire here with this little 4-wire JSTGH connector, and I need to connect that into what is called a UART, or a serial connection, on the flight controller. And basically, if you can see that, I'm just going to clip that in here, and that goes click. But basically that's going into what is called UART2, or Serial 2, which is how it'll show up in the ground control setup software, Mission Planner, or Q Ground Control. UART2 on this Zealot H743 flight controller is the one, this is techie stuff, skip past it if you don't care, but is the one port on this flight controller that has bidirectional DMA. So it does direct memory access, in other words, bloody fast, for both receive from the transmitter to the receiver and into the flight controller, but also in reverse, because a flight controller sends an awful lot of data back to the transmitter into the ground control station via a back channel. And so the transmit means that this UART here can run at 420,000 bits per second, which is still pretty slow compared to some of the communication technologies that we have these days, but is an awful lot faster than the old-fashioned way of doing it in ArduPilot land, in flight controller land, where it was 57, 600K or even 115K, pretty much, you know, dial-up modem speed. So we got something a little better. So that now is your flight controller, and that is actually enough to get this basic thing working. And so why don't I do that? Got my transmitter here, and just for safety's sake,
telemetry ready.
I am going to use
Switch warning.
I'm going to use my smoke saver. I really don't think could possibly be anything wrong with this circuit, but it's always best to be safe than sorry. So I'll use a smoke saver to connect. This normally won't be in the plane. This is just for getting things working on the bench. And I'll connect the battery to the smoke saver, and and now we have power.